Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's God Talks. Tonight, I'm going to be talking to Ross Murray, and Ross Murray works for the GLAD organization, and he focuses on education. A couple of years ago, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, I was trying to help a friend who was struggling with a religious organization in which they were essentially going to just be fired because of who they were. And I was trying to find resources, trying to reach out to folks to see who might give advice or who might be able to help us in the midst of that situation. And one of the folks I came in contact with was Ross Murray, who kind of connected with me out of the blue. Not only did he immediately, I felt like, respond to the email that I had sent to him at GLAD, but then also even provided a personal touch of offering me his phone number to call and talk me and my friend through the circumstances that we were experiencing. It's those kind of connections. It's that kind of community that I think is valuable, was valuable back then, and is valuable right now. So join me in welcoming Ross Murray. Hi, Ross.
Hello. Thank you for having me on here.
I'm glad that you're able to be with us tonight on God Talks. You have seen some of these, so you have a sense of the flow of the conversation. But as I invite everyone to know that so much of this is going to be about what comes up between you and I as we're having this conversation. So, Ross, I gave a little bit of an overview, and you'll say more about your specific role at GLAD a little bit later. But I want to start the conversation by asking you, how might some folks in the LGBT community who know that you have a connection to faith and a connection to GLAD, how might they describe you?
So there's different categories of people. Some are fascinated by it. And have a hard time like, oh, you're a deacon and that's what you do. And so they're kind of the like weirdly curious folks. I think there's a big chunk of people that really are a part of the LGBTQ and religious communities. And I think they find it really refreshing. There's a big national secular organization that has someone that does religious work, that comes from a religious background and can kind of talk that way. And then I think there's also, I think there's folks, again, that kind of surprised that like still don't think those two things can be married and that those two things can actually go together. And they exist both within parts of the LGBTQ community and also can exist like within anti-LGBTQ communities, wanting to say like, well, he can't really be that Christian if he's gay. So I think you kind of get that. Other than that, I think some probably think maybe they think I'm intimidating. I talk fast and I have a very intense look on my face. So I hope that they think I'm funny and sarcastic, but they might just think I'm intimidating.
So I want to jump right in. Maybe you can say a little bit about what you are specifically doing at GLAD, but what are some experiences that led you to the current work that you're involved in?
Yeah, I've just celebrated my 9-year anniversary at GLAD. And I know. And so I started doing all religion all the time. My original title was Director of Religion, Faith, and Values. And that was really fun. I mean, I'm a Lutheran. I'm part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So I know that denomination really well and its structure. And I think through GLAD, I sort of, I didn't learn all the theology of every single religious group, but I kind of learned the structure and how things worked. And as an advocate, like, oh, this is how you're going to have to do it in this community, and this is how you're going to have to do it in this community, and kind of being strategic that way. And then as things go with nonprofits and with funding and whatnot, I've shifted from religion to news, the U.S. South, which is odd because I'm from the Canadian border in Minnesota, so like the opposite of South, and global work, which I love doing too. And now over the last 4 years, I guess, I've been leading the GLAD Media Institute, which is focused on training and education. So a lot of workshops, a lot of consultations, a lot of kind of proactive training offerings that we used to kind of just do when people would ask it, but now I'm proactively scheduling it. And we're kind of building this army of people that know how to do the same sorts of things that I had to do from working at GLAD.
Why, in your understanding at the beginning, why was an organization that, as you described, this secular organization like GLAD, creating this director of faith? I mean, what made sense at that time in the consciousness of that organization?
Right. And I was the second director of religion, faith, and values. So there was a woman named Ann Craig who had done it for, I think, 4 years before me. And I think what happened, if you remember back in 2004, that presidential election, the exit polling was so much centered on people saying that they were voting on religious values. And religious values in that context meant an anti-marriage amendment, either nationally or in particular states. It meant a strong focus on restricting reproductive rights, right? It was shorthand, and people didn't say, I want the gays to not get married, but they would just say religious values. And so these LGBTQ organizations that realized they'd actually kind of ignored religion for a long time, tried to go around it, realized, no, if we're going to deal with this, we're going to have to face it head on, and we're going to have to work within those communities as well as outside the communities. And I feel like that's what I've been able to do. Even when my work isn't religiously focused, I still go in and I say I'm a deacon. I still go in and pull out my credentials so I can give a sense of I know what I'm talking about. And people can take what I'm teaching in my courses and apply that to whatever their setting is. If they're trying to make their church more welcoming, or if they're trying to oppose a law and using really good religious language, that means we should be having laws that protect LGBTQ people and other groups. I feel like it's in the same strand as for right now, Dr. William Barber, the Moral Mondays. So we need to give it some really explicitly religious language, which we've done before, but I feel like we kind of drifted away from it. And every so often you get this interest in, oh my goodness, there's a religious left. But the religious left has always been there. I think it's just a matter of how much we're paid attention to.
Okay, that's a great segue, because one of the tensions I often feel is that a more conservative evangelical church, they become, quote, the religious narrative in all media, whether it's even a CNN versus a Fox News, it's still, that is the religious voice. What feedback or maybe kick in the pants might you offer to more progressive faith communities that are still, not really capitalizing on that sort of outward vocal presence in relation to their faith?
Yeah, I think that we as religious progressive people need to be much more bold and much less apologetic about it. I feel like what we get a lot is, well, I'm Christian, but I support LGBTQ people. And the but shouldn't be there. I am a Christian or because I'm a Christian, I support LGBTQ people. And we spend less time apologizing for it and explaining it and more time living into it. There's plenty of scripture that talks about protecting the marginalized and the poor, and LGBTQ people can be included in that. There's a lot of scripture that's really queer stories, right? But it's not been interpreted that way because we don't push that narrative heavy. We kind of do our own Leviticus doesn't really mean what you think it means. And when you do that, that doesn't actually proactively explain anything. All that does is say, it tries to be, and so I think we need to be much more bold and much more forward and less apologetic about how we approach scripture and how scripture motivates us to act and work in the world. And there are people, again, that do it really well now. And throughout our history, there's been a lot of folks that have done it really well. But I think we kind of got to a moment for a while of separating those out. And I'm hoping that it's starting to come back together. And I think I've seen evidence of it in the last few years, but there's still a really strong narrative of anti-LGBTQ people have been so loud and so much defining who gets to be a Christian and who doesn't get to be a Christian, and what real Christians believe, that it's going to take a lot of work to undo that. And that's one thing I do. I don't like being anti-folks, but I've gone on rants. My latest target has been Franklin Graham. He set up his tent hospital here in New York City, and I was not excited about it. He put this tent hospital up, and I realized I don't like that this guy came into my city and oh, we'll create a hospital and we're going to help you and we're going to do that. And then I thought, that's actually probably how a lot of how global missions and colonialism works. And now that I've actually been on the receiving end of it, now I realize I don't like it, which means I have a little bit better understanding of this is why other folks, communities, countries, cultures don't like it when we sort of drop in and say, well, we're going to come in and fix you. because I didn't like it when I got it.
Right. You said a key phrase that I want to talk about more broadly, but then I want to go personally. So I'll give you both so you can think through it. The first one is, why do you feel we're apologetic? I mean, so much of, I think, progressive Christianity is an intellectual exercise. We are thoughtful. We have done the research. We've done the exegesis of the text. And yet again, there is that apologetic. So I'm curious as to what you think that's about. And then part B of that is, if you are demanding to stop being apologetic, Ross, that might mean, I assume, that at some point you stopped apologizing. So I want to hear about why you think Christianity, progressive Christianity, is still apologizing. And then I'd love to hear when you stopped apologizing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happened, and again, I saw this a lot. I think it's the most prominent in presidential elections. And I go back to that 2004 year, the John Kerry year. There's a lot of compartmentalization. There's a lot of, and I think if I was a better historian, I could probably go back to watch how presidents have talked about their faith and talked about how that's going to impact their policies. And so you kind of do this like, oh yes, that's a part of who I am, but I make rational decisions about policy. Like my faith doesn't impact my decisions. And going back to like John F. Kennedy having to explain to people like, yes, I'm a good Catholic, but I'm going to lead the country. I'm not going to follow the Pope, right? Like those same kind of accusations get thrown up of like, oh, well, you can't. And I feel like that happened to John F. Kennedy as a Catholic, right? I think if we ever have a non-Christian president, that's going to happen for them as well, right? Those same sorts of things. And they're going to have to do that. And I feel like that compartmentalization kind of happens. We're like, well, no, I'm a good, hardworking, smart person, and I'm a faithful person. And in some way, we sort of somehow separated those two things out, maybe for our own, maybe for comfort with our own progressive groups, especially by people who got hurt by the church. Because I think the place where I felt the most apologetic was around folks that had a history with the church and walked away and had a really hard time understanding how I could still stay in a relationship with an institution that they knew hurt them so bad. Yeah. And I think I stopped apologizing. I stopped apologizing when I realized, I don't think I was hurt as bad as most other folks are. I've had my own stories. I've had my own experiences, but I've been a pretty privileged person, and that propelled me into, if I can't do this as effectively and with all the resources and all the privileges that I have, it's got to be that much harder for other folks as well. And so then saying, okay, what I'm going to do is work to make the church more welcoming, more inclusive, more of an advocate for us as a community. And I want to do that not just within the church, but also have that be an influence on the society.
What do you think pushed you to want to have that kind of influence? Like, what are some markers along your own journey that authored that in your life?
Yeah, when I was growing up, I wanted a church job. I don't think I ever wanted to be clergy. I've never had an interest in being a pastor. I love you all, but no. But like, I'll be like a youth minister. That was something I talked about. No, I did my undergraduate in, and I kind of knew at the time the policy of my denomination was one of exclusion, and that it would be challenging. And I actually kind of convinced myself, like, oh, it's okay. I'll just be single. And then I met my husband, and that changed. And I sort of thought, okay, well, maybe I'll figure out how to thread this somehow. And then after college, I joined this traveling musical ministry team, and we would ride around the country in a airport shuttle, essentially, and we'd do these little programs at churches, and they would treat us like rock stars. And I was on an international team. We were going to the United States, but then we're supposed to spend a portion of the year overseas in Papua New Guinea and Hong Kong, and then coming back. And I had such a positive experience being out in my college, being an active part of campus ministry, like just having these things wed together in my life, that I sort of thought, like, well, I could rely on my own natural charm, and people would just see, oh, he's a good, faithful person, and he happens to be gay. And that community, that traveling musical ministry team, didn't react that way. And it surprised me that there were folks that said, "Oh no, I see this is going to be a big problem. You shouldn't be helping to distribute communion because that's desecrating the communion. Maybe we shouldn't have this openly gay person here in front of the church talking and teaching and singing and whatever." That went on for a few months until after about 4 months, the president of the organization decided it was easier just to kick me out than to let the other folks that had a bigger problem with me get removed. And that was my like kind of soul searching. Like, do I give up on the church? Do I give up on God? Well, no, this is really people that did this. I've had a really good job of separating like God is good and people are assholes. Can I say that on the show? And so I can, and so recognizing like that's not my problem. And the church is a human institution. We're trying and not succeeding really, but that's also what the grace of God is for. And so why don't I do this work so that other people don't have to go through kind of experience that I did, where I went through this, organization that evangelical influences, very music focused, very artistic, people coming in with really strong ideas about what Christianity is and is not. And me wanting to craft something different. And I never want to go through that experience again. It was horrible. But all the stuff that I've done since then, the naming project and GLAD and my work for what's now called Reconciling Works and changing my denomination's policy on LGBTQ people, all that came because I had that experience back 20 years ago this year.
Wow. So thinking about that, here you are pouring yourself out, trying to find maybe the middle way. I'm not going to completely rock the boat, but I'm not going to completely throw this away. And somehow the system told you, no, you have to choose. You either have to not be authentically who God has created you to be, or be who you are supposed to be within this choir. I still want you to say more about maybe from your childhood or upbringing, but something planted inside you that made you say, no, like, it's fine. If I'm out of this, I'm still not going to depart from my connection with the divine. What was that? Because some people, Ross, would have just given up. I mean, when the choir thing happened and the international stuff, they would have just said, okay, like, this is, as many of the people you've talked about, no, I'm kind of done with this. But you didn't. I mean, you sort of claimed your own faith from this organization. I
was incredibly blessed growing up. I had a great family. I came out when I was 19 to my family, and it took what I call one awkward conversation with my mom. And and I said this to you before, but I am very like Scandinavian conflict avoidant type person. So I know when I came out to my mom, I put a lot of qualifiers in front of, like, I think possibly that I might be gay. Like, I put a ton of stuff. Like, there were a lot of outs that she had before that. And so, and then after realizing, like, okay, no, this actually is who I am. The other person that I came out to was my pastor growing up. And he was, it's providence or it's luck or whatever, but he was the right person. And I was an angsty teenager that wanted to be angry at everybody. But he was able to put up with that really well. He knew that I had gifts for ministry, and he identified those and he named them. He also was really upfront with me of like, this is where our church's policy is right now. And this is going to be some of the difficulty and the struggle you're going to face. So he wasn't like really Pollyanna-ish about it. He sort of said, this is going to be a challenge. He even said, I don't know if I see that policy changing in my lifetime. So he made a prediction like, there's been these meetings, we've done this, it's been brought up, and I don't know if anything's going to happen. And when it did happen, he was there, and he told me he was very, very happy to be wrong. But I think part of it is if I hadn't had him as the face of the church, I probably would have been one of the people that said, this is not worth it, I'm going to walk away. But growing up, I was very invested in church. I'm from a teeny tiny town in northern Minnesota. We had 818 people in town. And the Lutheran church is the big church in town, which meant we had 300 members. And I was that guy that like the kid that was like teaching Sunday school, playing piano and organ for worship services. Like I was doing everything. This kind of was like my life. I was active in school too, but I think partly is I was such a doer, it kind of made being a churchy person a part of my identity, and that making it a part of my identity actually made me live into the belief that much more. And made me not want to leave when I hit a road bump. And also when I hit a road bump in an institution that I knew was not my congregation or not even my denomination.
So would you say that caused the level of separation or dissonance that you needed to be able to hold fast?
Yeah, and it also got me, I mean, I'm also a fairly cynical person. So I think this is also why I like church politics. Like how do I put this? I don't expect better things to happen. I believe in sin. Like I sort of believe we try really hard and we probably want to all be good people. And yet in so many ways, we are not. And then when we are, and when things go well, I get to be really pleasantly surprised. Like, it sounds flippant to say it that way, and maybe it's a little bit of a self-protection device. But I think that if I have a strong enough belief that we live in a broken, sinful world and we need the grace of God in order just to redeem ourselves, it means there's so much less pressure on us to have to do everything right, we don't have that fear of analysis paralysis. Like we will try. And when we try, most of the time we're going to fail. But if I sit home and don't do anything, that's actually worse than not trying in my mind. It makes me feel freer to go out and be bolder and be less apologetic about my faith and do social justice work that doesn't directly benefit me, because I sort of have this assurance of like, I'm going to try and I'm going to mess it up. And if I don't happen to mess it up, well, then good job me. But let's be aware that like everything I do is going to be a learning opportunity. I'm going to have to learn from every single mistake that I've made and probably just keep going and going, and hope and pray that the grace of God can at least use something of what I'm doing.
I think that's a profound way to explain humanity, right? How people show up as distinctly and uniquely human, even as a minister trying to sort of walk with what the divine might be offering, like my interpretation of how God might be manifest in the world. So on that same vein, you're a teenager telling this pastor who you are, with hope or not hope in your context of what this person is going to be human and they're going to do the best that they can. But for a clergy person who might be watching this, who will have a Ross, who's going to come and sit and talk to them, what's some feedback, thoughts, advice, wisdom you might give that pastor, even in their fumbling, and maybe they're going to make a mistake and maybe they're not going to do it as perfectly, but what's something you can say as maybe a word of encouragement or press for them so that they also might provide that same, I guess, tangibility of faith that you left the conversation with?
Yeah. I think one of the most important pieces is that we have to really listen to what a young person tells us, and we have to believe what they say. And it sounds incredibly simple, but I think as adults and as ministers and as clergy and people that have gone through, advanced degrees and whatever, and also as adults who have seen kids grow up, it's so easy for us to project onto who we think that they are. And that listening and believing is really important to get a sense of who they are. And that might be very different than what our expectations are. And I say this, I run an LGBTQ youth ministry, and I have to do that with LGBTQ youth. Like, oh, I can tell what you're going to grow up to be like. But it's not my story. It's not my life. And often that's more about me than it is about them. And I think believing folks asking more questions in a way that can get them to share more about their lives, even if they don't have good language or about it, or have formed how this is all fits together in their own mind. That sheer thing of like just getting to say it out loud to an adult, a caring adult who says, I really appreciate this. That you are absolutely loved by God and by this community, and keep, I want to hear more about who you are and who you're going to become. And I think that's going to be really, really important for people to pay attention when young people are starting to come out to them. It's really that, like, how do we believe them?
Mm. Mm. And then, I think this not only belief, but I still hear in that pastor, but then also in you as a young person, courage, courage to sort of name who you were. And then just trust God. I mean, like, I love this sense of there's the people of God, but then there's God, and I'm worried about my connection with God. I want to drill down a little bit more in terms of you personally. So, Ross, right now, what would you say is your personal vision or mission in your life right now?
Oh, what is my mission? It's odd. I'm really good at looking at myself in my current context and getting very into it. And then when my context changes, like, oh, things change. I really do think that part of my mission is to have people know and understand that they are made and known and loved by God, and that they can live that out loud in the world. Mm. And it's both working with people to get a sense of who they are, how they relate to the rest of the world. That's a lot of what I do through the naming project. And I feel like the glad side of that is we have to get society in a place that lets people live out loud, to be who they are freely and unapologetically, and live that abundant life.
How do you feel that your own personal faith is sort of intersecting with that vision and mission, this love of God, this access, this extravagant welcome to completely be your authentic self? How is your faith kind of holding that up for you?
I think for me, it's a little bit within what I describe as my calling, in that what I think I had to get to a point to be able to articulate and understand and be very comfortable with who I am, and like who I am as a gay person, as a man, as a white person, as all of these aspects of my identity, and recognizing that I also have an opportunity to intersect and interact with so many different folks, and I want them to be happy, healthy, successful. And part of that is there's work for them, but there's also like, how do we make enough space to be able to do that? And I feel like for me, I had to figure out who I was, which makes me comfortable enough to work with folks that are different than me, because I feel secure enough in who I am that I'm not threatened. But I have a good understanding of me, which also means that I can figure out my relationship with other people so much easier because I feel comfortable with who I am.
Mm-hmm. What do you think gave you clarity as you were sort of discerning the big archetypal question of who you are? And then I don't believe that you're saying all of that has worked out. But yeah. what you know so far, what curated that knowing? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
What did curate that? I mean, yeah, I do think it's absolutely a work in progress, and I do think it's something that I cycle back and forth on, and I feel like every new experience I have kind of re-challenges that and reshapes that and helps me figure out who I am. One of my biggest interests, which came from seminary and it sort of like has played out through the naming project and elsewhere, is this like relationship between identity, who am I, and vocation, what am I going to do? And I think for me, I focus a lot on the doing aspect. And part of what's been really important to me is to kind of like every so often stop and reflect and figure out who am I and what is the who I am? How does that match my context or my situation? So then what do I do in that situation? And I feel like that's kind of, it's been interesting. I've sort of like, I talked to a friend a long time ago and, he's sort of like, maybe your identity is like the pit in the middle of a peach. You got to get through all these layers to get to it. Peaches don't have layers, but go with me on this. Where they sort of get to the core at the middle. And I sort of said, like, what if you get to the middle and there's just nothing there? Like it's an onion. And then I brought this up later in seminary, and one of my professors, instead of those analogies, sort of said like, well, what if your identity is more like a kaleidoscope and you have all these pieces of the things that make you you? And when we get put in a different situation, that context just turns it, and these pieces fall together in a different kind of configuration. And so, if I'm in one space, there's going to be a part of my identity that's going to be more apparent or more important. And when I get to a different space, it's going to be something else. And I think I feel that way. And now that I'm a professional gay, so I'm often going to spaces and I'm like doing the LGBTQ like advocacy or training or whatnot, which I did today. I did a training that someone from my high school asked me to do for her workplace. And I thought, okay, yes, these are like all northern Minnesota people. It's a fairly conservative region. I'm from there. Maybe I can relate. We'll find out. And so I can front load that part of my identity, right? And then I think I go into other spaces and realize like, okay, me being gay is less important, but in this context, me being white seems to be a really big part of my affect, or me being male, or me being there's millions of different things. I keep saying the same thing, 3 to 4 things, but I think they sort of fall together, and there's always this like, I am who I am, but what's going to come to the forefront is going to change with every relationship or every context or every situation. And that's challenging because I think I want to like be a static person that's kind of always the same. But static me wouldn't go very well from one context to another. But it's uncomfortable to do.
So speaking of coming from Minnesota, and the world, Minnesota in many respects is like a epicenter for this call to justice, this call for an end to white supremacy, this call for the elevation of Black lives, or in all Black lives in this context. So as a person who's able to think of your identity in the shifting terrain and context, who is Ross Murray called to be with all of the gifts and the background, but also the challenges of your own walk? Who are you called to be in this particular context?
I think it's going to be different things to different people. And especially because you said Minnesota's kind of become the epicenter for this call for racial justice. And I guess this is true. When you're from there, you have a bias, right? Like for so long in the history I've looked, I've said like, oh, Minnesota is so much better than all these other places that I've seen, right? And I see these stories breaking in other parts of the country. And I sort of like had this belief that Minnesota had sort of transcended that. That's not true. And being from there, I've got that you kind of like build this bias and you want your home to be better, but it's got a really racist history. That has emerged not even just in the last few years, but over the last couple hundred years, the state's been around. And I think I had to recognize that and know that. And so now that we're in this moment, in this kind of uprising moment, one, I still feel a responsibility for my people back in Minnesota. And I think because of who I am, because of where I am, maybe I am someone that can work with and reach and connect and contact with them and talk about racial justice in a way that actually is going to make sense for them, or at least challenge them, because it's not a stranger challenging them, it's someone that they actually know or related to or went to school with. But that's one particular population. I think because I'm at GLAAD and I've got a very kind of public facing role there, then that role is making sure that we internally as an organization can do the work that's important for us internally, and to make sure that GLAD can be a good ally organization to racial justice groups, and how I do that within whatever my particular role is in that. And as someone who's here in New York, which has had a lot of its own uprising community, how do I support and be a part of that? And I feel like the answer to those three communities are different approaches, and I have different roles, and they're different parts of my identity that come again to the forefront. When there's a march here in Upper Manhattan, I'm not the one in the front. I'm not the one who's, leading and taking charge. I want to be there so that there are bodies and there are folks. And I've confessed this. I do not like rallies, and I don't like protests, and I don't like marches. I am like, even when they're celebratory, I still get like very weirdly uncomfortable. So I'm often like be in the margins. But I also know that numbers matter, and that folks showing up matter. And if I can be there and just be a body to make this crowd be that much bigger or stronger, that's going to be an important thing for me to do, which is a different role than, can I reach out to people that have a relationship with me and help them to understand why this moment is so important, and what at a minimum they could be doing to be helpful to this larger conversation. And I think I have to sort of like think of different audiences and approach them all in different ways.
So there's somebody who watching this, and I often think about the audience, right? Who is also from small town America. They still have those same connections, but they're thinking, it's just too difficult. This is just not an area. It's sort of the things you shouldn't talk about at Thanksgiving there.
Yeah.
Playing it out in their life. What wisdom would you give to them to empower them to know that actually I love how you framed it. I actually might be the voice that explains into the context in a way that, quote, my people might understand. What might you offer to someone who's kind of on the fence about making that post, or on the fence about calling up the high school friend, and challenging them towards change?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. And again, figure out what this looks like for me. There's a couple approaches. One, this goes back to the don't be apologetic. I've realized for a while I was doing things where I was responding to what other people were saying, being like, they'll post a meme on Facebook that is not connected, but is some snarky thing, and me doing a comment in that. I don't think they really care or read those comments, and all it does is make me see it more. Instead of being reactionary, I figured out that I have to be proactive. I have to be the one to share and put up the content first. Like, I'm not reacting to what they're saying. I'm actually putting, this is what I believe. This is what I stand for. This is what, and we're using Facebook as an example because we're talking on Facebook. This is what I have been called to speak or proclaim within this space of Facebook. And the second thing I would say, and I put this as a part of my training, but I also really personally believe it. I'm not a fan of memes. I think there are many that are funny, but I realize if I'm going to share something, even if I'm sharing a link or an article that I think is good, I have to put my own voice or my own commentary on top of it. It can't just be there to change. There's an Onion headline that says, "Area man supports gay rights after reading 300 pages of queer theory." And I sort of think that way. Like, if I just say, well, just read this article or just watch this video that comes from someone else, somewhere else. Again, what I've done is I've actually advocated my own voice. What I would rather do is use my voice to say, this is Ross. You know me. You've trusted me. Let me tell you, this is a good person to listen to. Let me tell you what they taught me and what was educational and what was helpful for me so that I could get it. And then the endorsement means that they're much more open to listen to this, third-party person, article, video, whatever, because some connection that they have has been able to say, this is what it means to me, and there's a personal reason for it, and then I can share that with them. Whereas I think if I just throw stuff up without any context, when I see opposition, I'll call them opposition people, folks from my hometown that'll share some stuff that's anti-LGBTQ or not helpful with the racial justice conversation. Sort of like what I see is like, oh, I'm just recycling some comment that someone else made. And I'm trying to figure out, how much is that you? How much do you believe the meme that you're putting up? And I want to make sure that when I'm sharing something, especially on social media, that they know that I believe in the thing that I'm sharing.
Mm-hmm. The personal connection to it, I think, embodies a different level of activism than sort of the passive post.
Yeah.
I copied and I pasted, and sometimes I've noticed the things that people post, they haven't even read.
Yeah. 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 I mean, and again, I see it, and I see it from folks, that'll come from this sort of another angle than I would. I see it from folks that are, on the same side as me, and they'll put up not helpful news articles or not helpful memes. And I'm sort of like, this isn't going to do much. And you're still not explaining like, what does this mean to you? And it's so much, I think we do a lot better. I don't know how you fix social media, quite frankly, but I think that we could do better if there was always some way to put our own endorsement, our own spin on top of it, sort of say, this is why I'm sharing this. And I kind of want to know that from folks sometimes too.
Connected to that, I wanted to, and I mentioned this to you earlier. So you work for GLAAD, right? I mean, I think a pretty prolific organization in the lives of, I think, the LGBT movement, but I also think in the national movement in the US around inclusion. And organizations like GLAAD or HRC historically until very recently. Some critique of those spaces is that they're predominantly operationalized by white folks, like in terms of an advocacy for the white experience. And there's often been an absence of voices of. Do you feel that in this season, I think of, racial unrest and the naming, claiming of, I mentioned to you earlier, a very distinctive Black trans voice that's sort of coming out and desiring to be seen and named in the full personhood of who they've been created to be? How do you see organizations like GLAAD or some of the other organizations you might be connecting to responding to that, the uplifting of those voices?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because I think that critique and that perception is really fair and right for GLAAD and for HRC and probably for a lot of organizations that put ourselves at the forefront. And it's funny because it's been something that we've actually had a lot of internal conversation about, recognizing that we need to do better work in terms of both diversity, equity, inclusion, kind of that like HR terminology, but then also like, what does this look like strategically? How do we become an anti-racist organization? And I feel like, when it is sort of like an HR conversation, HR type conversation, that's different. And I think this moment actually calls for something different. And to make sure that we can be in the state that we are right now, that we can be good allies to the community, and that we can also use this to say, this is an area that we have a shortcoming. It's something that we don't have covered, that we don't have included. And over the time that I've been at GLAAD, and probably before then too, we've had some great leaders of color, but they've often been kind of one or two people who I'm going to guess, I'm not them, but probably end up feeling fairly isolated and knowing that they kind of were the one or two folks. And I think for me, I can't speak for the entire organization, but for me, knowing that I am a white guy in the organization, at this point, an older white guy in the organization, that comes with a fair amount of power and privilege with it too, just sort of, how much can I use that to make sure that my colleagues who are brilliant and do really great work can be as successful as possible? And that might mean, can I help remove barriers that get in front of them? Can I do some of the, inter-office political stuff that you have to do just to be effective? And I think that's going to be a conversation that we're going to have to keep having going forward as we look internally, and as we strategically, as an organization, what are the next steps? What are we going to do, and how are we going to do it? What that's going to look like externally. And I feel like those are two things that have to happen at the same time, even though there's a little bit of a distinction between the audiences there.
One of the things you've sort of named is, I feel like, you use the term call. And you mentioned earlier that one of your calls was to pursue becoming a deacon. Can you talk about So all of the skills and talents, I guess, that you're using in this venue, you also felt a call to pursue being a deacon, to seminary, to talk to me about maybe the call there, but then how you see those things intersecting.
Yeah, well, okay, so this is kind of just part of my like vocational history, because I went to college, I did that traveling music ministry team, and then I went to seminary right after that. At the time, the ELCA had a policy that, openly gay people had to be single and celibate, and I was not. So I just said, I'm just going to get the degree. I'm not going to go through candidacy. I'm not going to be clergy. I'm not going to do any of this. And I did. I got the degree in 2003. And then through working for the Lutheran LGBTQ advocacy organization, it's now called Reconciling Works. It had a different name back then. In 2009, I was part of the team that got the ELCA to change its policy and to start finding ways to recognize what committed relationships are like, and how that the church can honor those and have those be a part of them, that clergy and other rostered leaders like deacons can also be included in that. So after that happened, there was a bit of a questioning for me about, well, do I want to keep doing what I'm doing? I'm in this advocacy organization. And maybe I could have a stronger, closer, more accountable relationship with my church, with my denomination, by being a rostered leader. And so then I entered candidacy, which you're supposed to do while you're in seminary. And I remember I lived in Minneapolis at the time, and I met with one of our synod bishop people. And she said, "Oh, we can fast track you." And I said, "Oh, do not make promises that none of us can keep." And there's kind of like 3 steps. But again, between the first step and the second step, there's nothing to do besides take classes, which I did. So I did the first step and the second step pretty much immediately. And then I got a job at GLAD, and I moved to New York. And that sort of disrupted all the other like hoops you have to jump through. And it's like spiritual direction and a very long retreat that they make you go on once a year, and a big project. And like that stretched out for 5 years. So when I finally finished that, I was in New York, and I asked the bishop if I could, and at that time, this is also ELCA church politics that are weird, but I was a diaconal minister. There were 3 lay rosters: diaconal ministers, associates in ministry, and deaconesses, which are like Lutheran nuns. And I was consecrated to being a diaconal minister and my calling was LGBTQ advocacy at GLAD. So GLAD is the setting in which I do my ministry, not a congregation. It was my job for 5 years before it was my call, but now it's my job and my call, and those are weirdly tied together. And then the ELCA did the thing where they merged those 3 rosters into one thing, and we're all just called deacons now because we didn't really know what the difference was, and nobody else does either. So this is a little clearer, although everyone asks what a deacon is, and I realize every denomination, like, deacon means something different. And I love being a deacon. It's good. It's advocacy work is a good fit. I strongly believe that clergy, ordained clergy, their calling is word and sacrament, and most often that's fulfilled like in a congregational ministry setting. Deacons are doing work like I'm doing. It's office jobs, it's social work jobs, it's chaplaincy, stuff like that. And I kind of get protective. I used to be be a little anti-clerical in that, like, I'm a lay person, I'm not a pastor, these other people are pastors, but that's not me. But now they say they sort of past language to say that, well, we'll call the deacons ordained. So maybe I'm clergy now, I'm not sure, and I'm sort of struggling with that, my own identity, because I still want to call myself a lay person. And my Twitter handle is in lay terms, which is absolutely I'm not clergy language. But I mean, church politics a little bit is that often, like, what people think of when they think of leaders of the church is they think of pastors, right? They think of ministers, clergy, the little white collar, all that. And deacons kind of, this is my deacon outfit. This is all, like, we just dress and do whatever. I don't know. You're UCC, you might dress more casually than Lutherans do. But here on the East Coast, Lutherans are always dressed up. Except for deacons, we just sort of do whatever. And I kind of like it that way.
Thank you for that context. But I think also, I think you give a great example of how your vocation and the work in which you're called don't have to be so dichotomous. I mean, I think sometimes people live into their faith with, well, if I'm going to be LGBT, then I'll be also faithful. But those things are so mutually exclusive that they don't really connect. And I think you've been able to beautifully find a way. And I think there's probably somebody watching this who might be considering the same journey. And I think you offer some insight. So I want to connect that to my next question, which is, so between you and your God, Ross, how are you keeping the fire burning?
So in these days, I think my relationship with God, it's a good working relationship. It's the same way I describe my relationship with my husband a little bit too. Like, we get along really well. I think it's funny because there's sort of like waves of this, and I'm sort of taking the last 3-4 months when kind of quarantine happened in New York and we were going to be home all the time, not in work. We actually shifted a little bit to be much more routine based, and it was a little monastic. Like, I felt like we were doing, we were getting up, we had a schedule, we're going to go do these things, and we're going to commune and feed and foster my relationship with God, kind of the way that you'd see like a monastery do it with the hours. And I got really comfortable in that. And I think that my relationship with God was this really good, like, oh, I'm just kind of working and I'm going along and you're here with me and we're taking care of things and things are actually going pretty well, at least for us personally. In the time since the murder of George Floyd, I feel like my spirit, like everything that I sort of like was kind of cocky about, like, oh, I can handle this routine, this everything, kind of all very much got thrown off. And the routine is the same, but my spirit feels so much more heavy. And when I'm awake at night, kind of the moments now, my prayers to God are a little bit more, they're less like working relationship and a little bit like, oh God, I have no clue what's going on in the world and I'm kind of scared for everyone and everything right now. Can you please knock some sense into folks? Like, it's sort of that. It's kind of a prayer of like, we need some sense of peace and sanity and a care for the people that you've created. We need this blind allegiance to party or community or race to dial back so people can, so that people, I mostly mean white people here, can start to see what our relationship with other communities, other people are like, especially when they've been bad and unhealthy and dangerous and deadly relationships. And my prayers to God are much more pleading than they were 5 weeks ago, where I feel like that relationship was kind of rolling along, like a friend or a close coworker. And now I feel like, maybe because I feel helpless in so many ways, that's where like prayer becomes so important. And God, we need you right now, because I don't think any of us are well enough equipped to fix where we are. This is something that we're going to need you to lead and guide us through to do, and help us figure out what the right thing in this moment is going to be.
Thank you for sharing that. I think so many people feel the exact way you just articulated, and yet they don't have the words. I think the most profound thing to do is to say, well, power greater than me, we need you. And I think the next tension in that is to find out, where is our work in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I'm glad you said that, because I was thinking that, like, we cannot be like, well, I can't handle it, it's up to God, which means then, like, right, every oppressive system just keep rolling because I've washed my hands of it. And it can't be that. There is still a job, there's still a role for me and for each of us And my prayers for, what God can do to take control is to kind of like give us some level of enlightenment of like, this is the thing that you should be doing right now. This is the thing that you can be doing right now. And I recognize, and I felt this way for the last month, right? That if I look at everything that I'm doing, it seems very inadequate. And I sort of have to trust that those little inadequate things are getting added together with other people that are doing other little inadequate things that are leading up to something bigger. And that's kind of been my running prayer as we've gone through all this.
Speaking of other ways that people can connect, Ross, you gave us a little snippet of what you do with GLAD, but I also want to invite our people, as we're coming to our time closing together, to join you in supporting GLAD financially and in some missional points. But would you mind just taking a little bit of time and talking about GLAD, but also the naming project and ways in which people can get more connected to your work?
Sure. Yeah. The two things that I'm the most involved with, one is GLAD. You can see the URL there on the bottom of the screen. GLAD is a media LGBT advocacy organization. We are the media advocacy LGBT organization. And our work has been with entertainment and journalism and news and gaming and digital platforms and celebrity and pop culture, because we believe that those things actually shape and influence culture and how people know and understand the LGBTQ community. So if it's bad and defamatory and gross and stereotypical, that's what people are going to think are true. I don't know what that was. Someone's delivering something. And my husband will take care of it. And so my work has been both with media figures, but also with advocacy communities to help them learn how the media industry works. And I'm teaching a lot of classes right now online. People can join me at the GLAD Media Institute for how to use media as an effective tool for your advocacy. I'm doing a lot of focus right now on what that looks like in an election year. So you'll see a lot of those classes up. You'll see some other ones coming up soon. And then the naming project is an LGBTQ youth ministry and summer camp. It started as a meeting in Minneapolis when I lived there, and for the last 16 years, we've been doing a summer camp in central Minnesota, where you come in from around the country. And if you've ever been to a church camp, it looks a lot like a church camp, only way more queer and way more fabulous. And we're still singing the songs, doing evening worship, having campfire, morning prayer. But it's on an island in a lake, and it's kind of physically set apart. And it's a beautiful space. And since we can't gather this year because of COVID-19, next Sunday, we're going to do a virtual campfire. And we've been doing these roughly about monthly. We've taken some of the activities and the songs and the stuff we've been doing and doing that over a platform much like this. So if you visit the Naming Project's Facebook page, you can join us next Sunday night at 9:30 Eastern. For our virtual campfire. You'll get to listen to me lead us probably in some dumb songs. Other people lead us in much more touching songs, where one of my counselors is a professional dancer, and his job has usually been to teach the campers a choreographed dance. And I don't know how he gets them to do it. It looks incredibly complicated, but we have been putting out little snippets of him teaching a dance, and people have they're submitting videos, and he's going to compile those together into a dance video. So Darrell, if you want to be in the Naming Project dance video, I will send you a clip of Dwayne teaching you his little routine. It involves this. I remember this part. I haven't done my own video for it yet, and it's good. He chose Rihanna's "We Found Love in a Hopeless Place," which seems so timely and kind of perfect. And we might be in a moment that does feel very hopeless. And the fact that we do find love, speaks volumes. And he's done a really good job of finding quote unquote secular music and making it be incredibly meaningful and have such resonance for the young people. So I love the videos. I think they're fun, and hopefully we'll have a good one this week.
Well, if people are watching this, Ross, and you should know, I'm horrible with coordinated movement.
You can join me.
If I can do my own dance, I'm good. But if I got to follow steps, it's not going to happen. Ross, I want to thank you so much for your time tonight and for telling people more about the Naming Project and GLAD. Each of these, I've ended sort of offering some words of blessing and encouragement to the guests who've come to God Talks and sort of sown into the atmosphere of the folks who've been watching and liking and loving and commenting, but also just the people beyond this who will one day find this and wonder how can they have a relationship with God. So this is what came for me to you as you were talking. I think it's important to know that part of your call was an amplified voice, a voice to speak for those who are on the margins, a voice to speak for those who have been minoritized, a voice to speak for those who don't yet have the courage to make some of the traverses that you have made. There's a journey that you have taken that others are at the precipice. They're at the beginning and they just don't know if they can do it. And through you amplifying your voice, your narrative, your story, some of the wisdom that you've even shared tonight, I think you'll give people the light that they were looking for in an often dark place. The final thing that came to mind is this notion of ordination. Some people believe that ordination is a group of things that you've checked off, and then some ordaining body therefore pronounces you ordained, and therefore it happens. Other people believe that ordination comes from within the community. Somehow someone in the community and with you have been connected, have seen the gift of God in you, and therefore the community calls you toward it. Even another piece, and maybe all of these are together in some traditions, some people believe that God called you by name even before you were ever created in this particular existence or plane. And when God calls you by name, God also calls you by purpose. And that purpose God calls with a level of authority that therefore transformation and change can come. So I might offer to you, my friend, that you have been ordained. You've been ordained before the foundation of the world. You've been ordained for this moment and this hour to use your gifts and talents in the place that you are in this world to amplify voices so that those who are not seen again might be seen and those who have not been heard might be heard. So whether or not you have a REV before your name or the Deacon Murray before your last name, I hope you can walk in the faith and the understanding of an ordination that transcends all of our denominational guidelines and polities and policies, and knows that it's really an ordination for who we were created to be. So thank you.
Thank you. Amen.
I'm going to take you out for a minute, Ross, but thank you so much again for your time tonight. For those of you who are still here, I want you to join me next week. We're going to be talking to Reverend Naomi Washington Leaphart, and Reverend Naomi is just going to be sharing a little bit about her story, a little bit about the great work she's doing in Philadelphia, and look forward to seeing you next Monday night at 7 p.m. on God Talks. Hope you have a good evening.